The stagecoach lurched to a violent stop, throwing Catherine Walsh against the wooden bench. Her ribs screamed where bruises already darkened her skin, hidden beneath the high-necked dress that covered so many secrets. Through the dust-caked window, she could see nothing but endless prairie stretching toward mountains that looked like jagged teeth against the sky. Montana Territory. The end of civilization. The end of hope. Copper Creek, miss, the driver called down, his voice carrying the weariness of a man who'd seen too many desperate women making this same journey. Your intended should be waiting at the trading post. Catherine's hands trembled as she gathered her single carpetbag. Everything she owned in the world fit inside that worn leather case. The letters from Martin Hendricks had promised a fresh start, a general store that needed a woman's touch, a quiet life in a growing town. She'd answered his advertisement because staying in Boston meant dying slowly under her father's fists and her brother's cruelty. The bruises they left were nothing compared to the damage they'd done to her spirit. She stepped down onto the wooden platform, her worn boots sinking slightly into the dust. Copper Creek consisted of perhaps 20 buildings scattered along a single muddy street. The trading post stood at the center, its false front painted with faded letters advertising dry goods and supplies. A man emerged from the doorway, and Catherine's blood turned to ice water in her veins. Martin Hendricks was not the middle-aged shopkeeper his letters had suggested. He was perhaps 30, with pale eyes that crawled over her like insects and a cruel twist to his mouth that she recognized too well. She'd seen that same expression on her father's face before he struck. The bottle in Martin's hand explained the whiskey stink that reached her even from 10 feet away. "You're late," Martin said, moving closer. "And you're thinner than your photograph suggested. False advertising, that is." Catherine forced herself to stand straighter despite the fear coiling in her stomach. "The journey was long, Mr. Hendricks. Perhaps we might discuss the arrangements for our marriage inside, where it's more appropriate." His laugh was sharp and ugly. "Appropriate? You're a mail-order bride, girl. You gave up appropriate when you answered my advertisement. You belong to me now, and I'll discuss our arrangements wherever and however I please." He grabbed her arm, his fingers digging into the exact spot where her brother had twisted her wrist 3 weeks ago. The pain was blinding, but Catherine had learned long ago not to cry out. Showing weakness only made men like Martin Hendricks more vicious. She bit down hard on her tongue and tasted blood. "Let me make something clear," Martin said, pulling her close enough that she could count the broken veins in his nose. "I paid good money for your travel. I've got a license waiting at the territorial office. You'll marry me tomorrow, and after that, you'll do exactly what I say, when I say it, or you'll learn what real discipline feels like. Your letters said you were obedient. I'm counting on that being true." Something inside Catherine fractured. She'd traveled 2,000 miles to escape one prison only to find another waiting with the door already open. The prairie wind picked up, carrying the scent of sage and something else, something wild and free that made her chest ache with longing. In Boston, she'd been trapped by propriety and family obligation. Here, there were no neighbors to hear her scream. No police to file reports that would be ignored. No church ladies to whisper sympathetically while doing nothing. She was more alone than she'd ever been in her life. Martin dragged her toward the trading post, and Catherine's vision blurred with tears she refused to shed. Through the haze, she saw someone else standing near the hitching post. A man, tall and broad-shouldered, watching the scene with an expression of barely controlled anger. He wore buckskin leggings and a cotton shirt, his black hair falling past his shoulders in a way that marked him as Indian. Their eyes met for just a moment, and Catherine saw something there that she hadn't seen in any man's face before: respect, and a simmering fury at the injustice unfolding before him. Then Martin yanked her through the doorway into darkness, and the stranger was gone. Catherine spent her first night in Montana locked in a storage room behind the trading post. Martin had thrown her inside with a warning that she'd better adjust her attitude before morning, when the territorial judge would perform their marriage ceremony. The room smelled of tobacco and old leather, and the single window was too high and too small for escape. She sat on a pile of wool blankets, her body aching, her mind racing through options that all led nowhere. She must have fallen asleep near dawn because she woke to shouting outside. Male voices raised in anger, and then a crash that shook the building's thin walls. Catherine pressed her ear to the door, trying to understand what was happening. "You've got no authority here, Hendricks." The voice was deep and calm, speaking English with a precise formality that suggested it wasn't the speaker's first language. "That woman came here under false pretenses. Your letters promised her safety and partnership. What you're offering is slavery. She's my property, Nakoa." Martin's voice was slurred, drunken even this early. "I paid for her transport. The law says she owes me marriage or reimbursement, and she's got no money. So she'll marry me, and what happens after is between husband and wife. The law also says a woman can refuse marriage if her intended has misrepresented himself. I was there yesterday. I saw how you handled her. I know what you are, Hendricks. This whole territory knows what you are. There was a long silence, then Martin's laugh, bitter and sharp. You think they'll take an Indian's word over a white man's? You think that judge will side with you against me? Get out of my store before I have you arrested for trespassing. Open that door. Let me speak with her. If she chooses you freely, I'll leave. But I don't believe any woman who understands her options would choose what you're offering. The argument continued, but Catherine had heard enough. This man, this Nakoa, was trying to help her. She'd seen him yesterday, seen the anger in his eyes at Martin's treatment. Now he was standing up to her captor, risking trouble with the law for a woman he didn't know. The question was whether she had the courage to accept help from someone the world would call savage while refusing to recognize the real savagery happening inside these walls. The door suddenly swung open. Martin stood there, his face flushed with rage and alcohol. Behind him, she could see the tall Indian from yesterday, his dark eyes steady and watchful. Tell him, Martin snarled at Catherine. Tell this interfering bastard that you came here willingly. That we have an agreement. Catherine looked past Martin at Nakoa. Up close, she could see he was younger than she'd first thought, perhaps in his late 20s. His face was angular and handsome, marked with a thin scar along his left cheekbone. He wore his long hair in 2 braids wrapped with leather cord. But it was his eyes that held her attention, because they looked at her like she was a person deserving of choice rather than a possession to be claimed. I came here because I was promised safety, Catherine said quietly. I was promised partnership in a general store. I was promised a respectable marriage to a respectable man. She turned her gaze to Martin. You are not what you claim to be in your letters, Mr. Hendricks. You are not what you promised. Martin's hand flew up, and Catherine flinched backward, her body remembering too many blows. But the strike never landed. Nakoa moved with startling speed, catching Martin's wrist and twisting it away with controlled strength. Striking a woman proves exactly what kind of man you are, Nakoa said, his voice carrying an edge of steel beneath the calm surface. The judge will hear about this. The territorial marshal will hear about this. And every man in this territory who trades at your store will hear about this. You're finished here, Hendricks, someone else said from the doorway. Catherine looked over to see an older white man with a marshal's badge pinned to his vest. I've been getting complaints about your drinking and your debts. Hearing you threaten to strike a woman is the last piece I needed. You've got 1 week to settle your accounts and clear out of Copper Creek. Martin's face went purple with fury. This is because of her. That conniving. Careful, the marshal interrupted. Choose your next words very carefully. The lady has grounds to file charges against you for false representation and attempted assault. If she does, you'll be leaving in chains instead of on your own feet. The tension in the room was thick enough to choke on. Catherine felt dizzy, overwhelmed by the sudden reversal of fortune. Hours ago, she'd been facing a nightmare with no way out. Now men were defending her, supporting her claim, treating her testimony as if it mattered. Nakoa released Martin's wrist and stepped back, positioning himself between Catherine and her former intended. Miss Walsh, you're free to go. I have a wagon outside. I can take you to the mission, where the sisters will give you shelter while you decide what comes next. Catherine looked at this stranger who'd risked so much for her sake. Why are you helping me? You don't know me. His expression softened slightly. Because everyone deserves better than what you were being offered. Because I know what it's like to be powerless in a world that sees you as less than human. And because sometimes, the right thing to do is also the simplest thing to do. She took a shaky breath and nodded. Then yes. Please. Take me away from here. The wagon ride to the mission took them through landscape that stole Catherine's breath despite her exhaustion. The prairie rolled endlessly in all directions, interrupted by stands of cottonwood trees and the distant mountains that seemed to touch the sky. Nakoa drove the wagon with easy competence, his silence comfortable rather than oppressive. After a lifetime of men who filled every silence with demands or criticisms, Catherine found the quiet deeply restoring. You called him Chief, she said finally, remembering what Martin had snarled during their confrontation. Are you a chief of the Lakota? Nakoa glanced at her, something unreadable in his expression. I was. Before the treaties, before Copper Creek, I led a band of my people who lived in these valleys. Now we live on reservation land 20 miles east, and I spend my days trying to negotiate between two worlds that both seem determined to destroy what I'm trying to protect. I'm sorry, Catherine said softly. I don't know much about the treaties or the reservations. In Boston, they just called all Indians savages and said the West was being civilized. His laugh was short and bitter. Civilized. An interesting word for what's being done to my people. But I don't blame you for your ignorance. Most white settlers believe what they are told because questioning those beliefs would require acknowledging uncomfortable truths. He paused, then continued more gently. You risked your life to escape violence. You understand something about power and those who abuse it. That understanding is worth more than 1,000 textbooks. Catherine studied his profile, struck by the intelligence and sadness in his words. Why did you come to Copper Creek? Why weren't you on the reservation? I trade with the whites when I can, Nakoa explained. I bring furs and leather goods, and I buy supplies that my people need. Tools, cloth, medicine. The treaty says we're supposed to stay on reservation land, but it also says the government will provide for us. That promise has been broken so many times that I've lost count. So I break their rules to keep my people fed. That's dangerous, isn't it? Breaking the treaty terms? Everything is dangerous now, he said simply. Staying on the reservation is dangerous because we're dependent on government rations that rarely come. Leaving to hunt or trade is dangerous because soldiers treat any Indian off-reservation land as hostile. Teaching our children the old ways is dangerous because the government wants to take them to boarding schools and erase everything that makes them Lakota. We live in a time when survival itself requires constant courage. They rode in silence for a while, the wagon wheels creaking over the rough trail. Catherine's mind was spinning with thoughts she'd never had to consider before. Her own suffering had seemed overwhelming, but it was nothing compared to what Nakoa was describing. An entire people being systematically destroyed, their land stolen, their culture forbidden, their very existence treated as an obstacle to progress. I don't understand how you can help someone like me, she said finally. I'm white. My people are the ones doing this to yours. Nakoa pulled the wagon to a stop near a creek lined with willows. He turned to face her fully, his dark eyes serious. You think I should judge you by your skin color? Blame you for crimes you didn't commit? That would make me no better than the men who judge my people without seeing our humanity. He gestured toward the creek. There's water here if you're thirsty. We'll rest the horses before continuing. Catherine climbed down from the wagon, her legs stiff from sitting. She walked to the creek's edge and knelt, cupping water in her hands and drinking deeply. The water was cold and tasted of minerals and earth, nothing like the metallic tang of Boston City water. When she looked up, Nakoa was standing nearby, watching the horizon with an expression of deep concentration. What do you see? She asked. Storm coming, he said, pointing toward the northwest where dark clouds were building above the mountains. We need to reach the mission before it hits. Montana storms can be violent this time of year. They returned to the wagon and set off at a faster pace. Catherine noticed how Nakoa constantly scanned their surroundings, his attention never still. He was reading the landscape the way she might read a book, seeing signs and meanings that were invisible to her untrained eyes. Can I ask you something personal? Catherine ventured after a while. You can ask. I may not answer. That scar on your face. How did you get it? Nakoa's expression didn't change. A soldier's saber during a misunderstanding near the reservation border. I was hunting deer to feed my people. He thought I was raiding cattle. I explained in English that I had permission from the territorial agent, but he decided violence was easier than verification. I defended myself, and he received worse than he gave. But the incident ended with me in chains and him recovering in a military hospital, because that's how justice works when one man is white and the other is not. What happened to you? 2 months in a military stockade. I was released only because a missionary named Father Michael testified that I'd been hunting with written permission. But the damage was done. The incident gave ammunition to those who want all Indians confined to reservations permanently. One man's prejudice and quick temper created consequences for hundreds of my people. The first drops of rain began falling as the mission came into view, a modest cluster of buildings centered around a white church with a simple wooden cross. Nakoa drove the wagon up to the main building just as the sky opened up in earnest, rain hammering down with startling force. A woman in a nun's habit appeared in the doorway, waving them inside. Catherine jumped down from the wagon and ran for shelter, Nakoa close behind. Once inside, dripping on the wooden floor, she turned to thank him properly. But he was already backing toward the door. Sister Margaret will care for you, he said. You're safe here. The sisters are good people who judge based on character rather than circumstances. Wait, Catherine called out. When will I see you again? Nakoa paused, rain streaming down his face. Do you want to see me again? The question hung between them, loaded with implications that Catherine wasn't ready to examine too closely. But she knew her answer with absolute certainty. This man had saved her life and asked for nothing in return. He treated her with more respect in one day than she'd received from white men in 24 years. She wanted to know him, to understand him, to repay the debt she owed. Yes, she said simply. I do. Something flickered in his eyes, quickly hidden. Then I'll return in a few days, once you've rested and decided what you want to do next. The choice will be yours, Miss Walsh. It will always be yours. He vanished into the storm, leaving Catherine standing in the doorway, watching his wagon disappear into the rain. Sister Margaret's gentle hand on her shoulder guided her deeper into the mission, toward warmth and safety and the first good night's sleep she'd had in years. But her mind wasn't on sleep. It was on dark eyes and quiet strength, on a man who'd called her by her name and treated it like something valuable. 3 days at the mission gave Catherine time to heal, both physically and mentally. Sister Margaret and the other nuns asked no questions about the bruises that covered her arms and ribs. They simply provided hot food, clean clothes, and a small room where Catherine could sleep without fear for the first time since childhood. The sisters ran a school for both white and Indian children, teaching reading and arithmetic in the mornings and practical skills in the afternoons. Catherine spent her recovery time helping with the younger children, finding unexpected joy in their eagerness to learn. On the third evening, Nakoa returned as promised. Catherine saw his wagon approaching from the kitchen window where she was helping Sister Margaret prepare dinner. Her heart did something complicated in her chest, a sensation she didn't quite recognize. It wasn't fear, which had been her constant companion around men. It wasn't even simple gratitude. It was something warmer, something that made her hands unsteady as she dried the dishes. Go speak with him, Sister Margaret said kindly. I can finish here. Take a shawl, though. The evenings are getting cold. Catherine wrapped a borrowed shawl around her shoulders and walked out to meet Nakoa. He was standing beside his wagon, speaking quietly to Father Michael in a mixture of English and what she assumed was Lakota. When he saw her approaching, his expression softened into something that might have been pleasure. Miss Walsh, he said formally. I hope you've been well cared for. Please, call me Catherine. And yes, the sisters have been wonderful. I've never felt safer anywhere. Father Michael smiled at them both. I'll leave you two to talk. Nakoa, you're welcome to stay for dinner if you'd like. We're having venison stew, and I know it's nowhere near as good as your mother makes, but Sister Margaret does her best. After the priest left, an awkward silence fell between them. Catherine searched for words, unsure how to begin the conversation she knew they needed to have. Nakoa solved the problem by gesturing toward a bench beneath a large cottonwood tree. Will you walk with me? There are things we should discuss. They walked slowly around the mission grounds, neither quite looking at the other. The setting sun painted the sky in shades of gold and crimson, and somewhere in the distance, a coyote howled. Catherine pulled the shawl tighter around her shoulders. I've been thinking about what comes next, she said finally. The sisters have offered me work here as a teacher. I'm good with children, and I could make a life at the mission. It would be safe and respectable. But? Nakoa prompted when she trailed off. Catherine stopped walking and turned to face him. But I didn't come all this way just to hide from the world. I came because I wanted something different, something better than what I had. Teaching at the mission would be safe, yes, but it would also be small. Limited. And after everything I've survived, I find myself wanting more than just safety. Nakoa studied her face in the fading light. What do you want, Catherine? The question was direct, almost challenging, and Catherine found herself rising to meet it. I want to matter. I want my life to mean something beyond just enduring. I want to wake up in the morning with purpose instead of dread. I want to be seen as a person rather than a burden or a possession. She paused, gathering courage. And I want to understand this land, these people, the real Montana rather than the civilized fiction that people like Martin Hendricks try to create. Those are dangerous wants, Nakoa said quietly. Understanding my people, choosing to see us as human rather than obstacles, that will set you apart from other whites. It will make you an outsider in your own community. I've been an outsider my entire life, Catherine replied. Being an outsider by choice for a good reason sounds infinitely better than being an outsider because I'm unwanted and abused. Nakoa was quiet for a long moment. When he spoke again, His voice carried a weight that suggested he'd been thinking about this conversation for days. I came here today to offer you something. Not marriage, because I won't repeat Martin Hendrick's mistake of trying to bind you without giving you real choice. But I can offer you work if you want it. Real work, not charity. Catherine's pulse quickened. What kind of work? My people need a teacher who can help our children learn English without forgetting Lakota. Someone who can teach reading and writing so they can understand the treaties and legal documents that govern our lives. The government teachers at the reservation school are focused on erasing our culture. They punish children for speaking their own language, for practicing their traditions. I want someone who will teach skills without demanding cultural surrender. The offer was so unexpected, so perfectly aligned with what Catherine had just said she wanted, that she almost couldn't believe it was real. You want me to teach Lakota children on the reservation? I want you to teach Lakota children to survive in a world that's trying to destroy them, Nakoa corrected. But more than that, I'm offering you a choice. Come to my village, meet my people, see how we live. If you like what you find, if you believe you can help, then stay. If not, I'll bring you back to the mission or help you travel wherever you want to go. No obligations. No debts. Just honest work offered to someone I believe has the strength to do it well. Catherine's mind was racing. Everything she'd been taught about Indians was screaming warnings. They were dangerous, savage, uncivilized. But those lessons came from the same people who taught her that women existed to obey men, that questioning authority was sinful, that her suffering was somehow deserved. Those lessons had all been lies designed to keep her powerless. If I come to your village, she said slowly, what would people think? A white woman living among the Lakota? They would think many things, Nakoa admitted. Some would be suspicious. Some would be resentful, seeing you as a reminder of everything they've lost. But others would see you as a bridge between worlds, someone who chose to understand rather than condemn. And what they think would matter less than what you prove through your actions. And what would you think? Catherine asked, surprised by her own boldness. Nakoa's eyes met hers directly. I think you're the bravest person I've met in a very long time. I think you've survived things that would break most people. And I think that if you choose to come to my village, it should be because you want to, not because you feel obligated or because you have nowhere else to go. The honesty in his words struck something deep in Catherine's chest. This man, this chief who'd lost so much, was offering her choice and respect in equal measure. He was seeing her as she'd always wanted to be seen, as someone capable and strong rather than weak and damaged. I'll come, she said, the decision crystallizing as she spoke. Not forever, not yet. But I'll come visit your village and meet your people. I'll try teaching and see if I can truly help. And if it works, if I find that I belong there, then I'll stay. Nakoa's face transformed with a smile that made him look younger, less burdened. Then we'll leave tomorrow morning, if that gives you enough time to prepare. Bring only what you need. The journey is long, and the wagon space is limited. That night, Catherine lay in her small room at the mission, staring at the ceiling and wondering if she was making a terrible mistake. But beneath the fear was something stronger, a conviction that she was finally, for the first time in her life, moving toward something rather than running away. She was choosing her own path, and that choice mattered more than safety ever could. The journey to Nakoa's village took 2 days of traveling through landscape that seemed to exist beyond time. Catherine saw herds of antelope racing across the prairie, their white rumps flashing in the sunlight. She watched golden eagles circling overhead and listened to Nakoa identify bird calls she'd never heard before. He told her stories about the land, about places where his people had lived for generations before the treaties confined them. His voice carried both love and grief, and Catherine found herself aching for the loss of something she'd never known. They reached the village at sunset on the second day. Catherine's first impression was of how different it was from what she'd expected. The village consisted of perhaps 50 lodges arranged in a large circle, with a central area for cooking fires and gathering. Children ran between the lodges, their laughter carrying clearly across the open space. Women worked at various tasks, some tanning hides, others preparing food, still others weaving baskets or sewing clothes. Men sat in groups, speaking quietly or repairing tools and weapons. The arrival of Nakoa's wagon drew immediate attention. People emerged from lodges to watch, their expressions ranging from curious to wary. Catherine felt their eyes on her like physical weight, assessing, judging, trying to understand why their chief had brought a white woman to their home. Nakoa helped Catherine down from the wagon, his hand steady on her arm. Don't be afraid, he said quietly. Let them look. They need to take your measure just as you're taking theirs. An older woman approached, her long gray hair woven with leather strips decorated with beads. Her face was weathered by decades of sun and wind, but her eyes were sharp and intelligent. She spoke to Nakoa in rapid Lakota, her tone clearly questioning. Nakoa responded in the same language, gesturing toward Catherine. The older woman turned her attention fully to Catherine, studying her with an intensity that made Catherine want to fidget. But she forced herself to stand still, meeting the woman's gaze with as much respect and openness as she could manage. Finally, the older woman spoke in heavily accented English. "I am Winona, mother of Nakoa. He tells me you will teach our children the white man's words without stealing their souls. This is a large promise for one so small and soft." Catherine felt her spine straighten. She'd been called weak and inadequate her entire life, but she'd be damned if she'd accept that judgment from anyone anymore. "I may be small, Winona, but I'm not soft. I've survived things that would break larger, harder people. And I don't make promises I can't keep. If your children will allow me to teach them, I'll give them everything I have to offer." Something flickered in Winona's eyes that might have been approval. She circled Catherine slowly, still assessing. "You have marks," she said, gesturing toward Catherine's arms where bruises still showed faintly. "Who hurt you?" "Men who thought they owned me," Catherine said simply. "I left them behind." "Good. Women who allow themselves to be broken are no use to anyone." Winona turned to Nakoa and spoke rapidly in Lakota. Whatever she said made him smile, the expression reaching his eyes in a way Catherine hadn't seen before. "My mother says you may stay," Nakoa translated. "She will teach you our ways while you teach the children yours. She warns that she is a harsh teacher who does not tolerate laziness or stupidity." "Neither do I," Catherine replied, looking directly at Winona. "I think we'll understand each other well." The older woman's lips twitched in what might have been the beginning of a smile. "Come. I will show you where you sleep. Tomorrow, the real work begins." The following weeks transformed Catherine in ways she couldn't have imagined. Winona was indeed a harsh teacher, but fair, and Catherine discovered reserves of strength she hadn't known she possessed. She learned to identify edible plants, to tan hides, to speak basic Lakota phrases. In return, she taught the children English, using games and songs rather than the harsh methods employed at government schools. She taught them to read using stories that honored their culture rather than trying to erase it. Slowly, the village's wariness transformed into acceptance. The children adored her, following her around and eagerly demonstrating new English words. The women began including her in their work circles, teaching her skills while listening to her stories about Boston and the journey west. Even the men, initially distant, started acknowledging her presence with nods and occasional conversations. But it was Nakoa who dominated her thoughts. They spent hours together, him teaching her about Lakota traditions while she shared knowledge from her formal education. Their conversations ranged from practical matters to philosophy and ethics. Catherine found herself laughing more than she had in years, and sometimes catching Nakoa watching her with an expression that made her heart race. One evening, as autumn turned the prairie grasses gold and copper, Nakoa found Catherine sitting outside her lodge, watching the sunset. He settled beside her without speaking, comfortable in the shared silence that had become their habit. "You're happy here," he said finally. "It wasn't a question." "I am," Catherine admitted. "I never thought I'd find a place where I belonged, but this feels more like home than anywhere I've ever lived. The children love you. The grandmothers say you have a good heart. Even the warriors respect your courage." Nakoa paused, then continued more softly. "And I find myself unable to imagine the village without you in it." Catherine turned to look at him, her breath catching at the vulnerability in his expression. "Nakoa, what are you saying?" "I'm saying that I want you to stay, not as a teacher or a guest, but as part of my family. As my wife, if you'll have me." He held up a hand when she started to speak. "I know the complications. I know what it would mean for both of us. You would be choosing to belong to a people that the world is trying to destroy. You would face hatred from whites who see you as a traitor and suspicion from some of my people who can't forget what your people have done to us. It would be a hard life." "Every life is hard," Catherine said, surprised by the steadiness of her own voice. "The question is whether the hardship has meaning. Teaching your children, learning your ways, building something worthwhile with someone who sees me as an equal rather than a possession, that kind of hardship has all the meaning in the world." She reached out and took his hand, feeling the calluses from years of work and survival. "I came to Montana looking for safety. What I found was so much more. I found purpose and belonging and a man who treats me with the respect I've always deserved. So yes, Nakoa. I'll marry you. I'll stay here and help your people survive. I'll be part of this world you're fighting to preserve. Nakoa's fingers tightened around hers. You understand that this means choosing sides in a war that we're slowly losing? That loving me means standing with the Lakota against forces that want to erase us from existence. I understand, Catherine said firmly. And I'm choosing you, choosing this life, with my eyes wide open. I'm done running from hard things. From now on, I run toward them, because the best things I've found have always been on the other side of fear. They sat together as darkness fell, hands linked, watching stars emerge in the vast Montana sky. Around them, the village settled into evening routines, fires flickering to life, voices rising in song and conversation. Catherine felt the weight of her decision, but also its rightness. She'd traveled thousands of miles seeking freedom from violence and found something infinitely more valuable, a place where she could be fully herself, loved and respected for exactly who she was. The broken mail-order bride had found her home at last, not in the civilized town she'd imagined, but among people who understood that true civilization had nothing to do with buildings or technology and everything to do with how you treated one another. She'd found safety with a Lakota chief, yes, but more importantly, she'd found love, purpose, and finally, after a lifetime of searching, she'd found herself.